Hello everyone. Welcome. We're so glad you're here. My name is Sarah Hollenbeck, and I'm the co-owner of Women and Children First. We're one of the last remaining feminist bookstores in the United States. And we're so excited for today's conversation with Sahar Mustafah and Patty McNair. Tonight, we're celebrating Sahar's new novel, The Beauty of Your Face. Women and Children First is now partially open for business after several months of closure, but we plan to continue to host all of our events virtually, probably for the rest of 2020. So we hope that you'll come back and join us on Crowdcast for future events. On Tuesday, we'll be hosting Kathleen Rooney in conversation with Julia Fine in celebration of Kathleen's new novel, Share Me and Major Whittlesley. So join us back here at 7 o'clock on Tuesday. And on to a few housekeeping notes. At the bottom of your screen, there's a link to buy the book from Women and Children First. So I encourage you all to do that. I also would love all of you to ask questions using the Ask a Question box, also located at the bottom of your screen. And now on to tonight's event. Patricia Ann McNair is the author of And These Are the Good Times, as well as The Temple of Air. McNair's second short story collection, Responsible Adults, is scheduled for release in December of 2020, and we cannot wait for that. She teaches in the English and Creative Writing Department, graduate and undergraduate program at Columbia College. Sahar Mustafah is the daughter of Palestinian immigrants, an inheritance she explores in her fiction. Her first novel, The Beauty of Your Face, was named a New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice, a Los Angeles Times United We Read selection, and one of Marie Claire's 2020 Best Fiction by Women. It is currently longlisted for the Center for Fiction 2020 First Novel Prize. That's so amazing. And her short story collection, Code of the West, was the winner of the 2016 Willow Books Fiction Award. Mustafah earned her MFA from Columbia, where she was the recipient of the David Thurman Award for Best Fiction. And very recently, she was on the 2020 New City Lit 50 list. So congratulations for all those honors. And I'm just tempted to say how much I love both of these women. Their support and love for Chicago's literary community and this bookstore is boundless, and it has meant so much to me. And beyond that, I also have to say that The Beauty of Your Face is a knockout novel. The plot will pull you in, and the compassionately drawn characters will settle in your heart. As the publishing industry and our bookstore and the world at large do the necessary work of decentering white narratives, Sahar's novel is a rich example of the stories that need to be told and the stories that need to be heard. So please help me welcome Patty McNair and Sahar Mustafah.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you so much. Hi, Sahar. We want to thank Women and Children First for inviting us here tonight. We've been trying to have a conversation about this book for quite a while now. And we're really excited. We haven't had a chance to talk about it now and again, but to be able to talk about it with a group of listeners is really a great experience. We're very thrilled to be part of Women and Children First virtual series, and we appreciate the seriousness that this bookstore is taking our current situation, taking into our current situation. And in order to continue to have them do these wonderful things, please hit that buy the book button. Hit that buy the book button 2 dozen times if you can. So,
Patty, I think we are good. So just so the audience knows, yeah, we were delayed because we were having technical issues, and now I can hear you crystal clear. So I'm so happy.
Oh, good.
Yes.
I can hear you as well. That's great.
Oh, good.
So I hope you all can hear us as well. So, well, there's a lot of things that we want to talk about, but we thought, first, one thing that I wanted to say is that Sahar and I know each other. We met at Columbia College Chicago some years ago when she was actually a student of mine, and I was thrilled to have her as my thesis student when she was working on her first collection of short stories that then became The Code of the West and was a prize-winning first book. So I'm really thrilled in a lot of ways. I'm proud of her, but I'm also proud to know her and proud to read this book, proud to share this book with you. And we're going to start with her reading just a bit of what she has for us.
Oh, thank you. Yes, I want to thank Women and Children First, who have been a home for my first book and now this book. It means so much to be part of the Chicago community. And I just want to thank folks who are in the audience and spending time with us this evening. It really means so much. So I'm going to read from the chapter where my main character, Afaf, is actually a teenager. And I don't think I need to give anything more except that this book takes us back in time to Afaf when she's a young 10-year-old, and we just are on this journey. And it is interspersed with a white shooter who has entered the school in the present time, a school for which she is principal. But we're in the flashback chapter here. And she's gotten in trouble, and she's in the dean's office. He thumbs through a file and dials a number on his office phone. Mrs. Rahman, this is Dean Phillips from Hoover High School. He pauses, tapping his pencil on the edge of the desk. Do you speak English? He nods at Afaf. Good, good. I have your daughter, Afaf, in my office. She struck another student, ma'am. Hit a girl. Yes. He neglects to tell Mama that it was Angela Malone who grabbed her hair first. She did feel a certain satisfaction in the way her knuckles crunched into Angela's cheekbone, but getting blamed for the entire incident? The bell rings and the hallway outside the dean's office fills with the pandemonium of another passing period. Lockers slam shut and footsteps thunder to the next class. Afaf tries not to squirm in her chair. Coach Phillips says into the phone, "You'll need to pick her up. 3-day suspension, ma'am." A pause. "Yes, she'll be waiting for you." "Thank you, ma'am." He hangs up and jots something down in her file, closes it. He leans back in his swivel chair, hands folded across his potbelly. Are you planning on not graduating, Miss Rahman? Afaf folds the soiled sheet of paper towel over and over, ignoring his question, pretending to be cool. But it's the second time this semester she's been in his office. Last month, she cursed at a boy in her physics class. Mr. Biggs had posed a problem about velocity, and a classmate had snickered something about the speed of a camel. But cursing out a classmate is one thing. Laying your hands on them is another. Perspiration trickles down Afaf's back. The adrenaline from punching Angela has faded, and the dean's lack of compassion leaves her feeling hollow and alone. 3 strikes and you're out, young lady. Afaf stares icily at Coach Phillips. No matter what, she'll never show them she's scared, never reveal how truly weak she is. Every year, the social worker calls her down to her office, and Afaf listens to the same lecture. You have choices, Afaf. We can control what we can in our lives. The social worker had wanted to know, are your parents strict, Afaf? Are you having trouble at home? Afaf had suppressed a laugh. Strict. White people think she's locked up the minute she gets home, that she is oppressed and not free. Mama and Baba barely acknowledge her, let alone care what she does outside of school. Maybe if they did, she wouldn't be sitting in the dean's office again. I think I'll pause there.
Okay, I so love teenage Afaf, I have to say. I think she's just wonderful. And there's so much in this book, as I said, that I just love to talk to you about. It's so full, it's lovely, it's heartbreaking, it's full of faith, it's full of grief. It's very, very unflinching, but at the same time, there's a whole sense of affirmation that happens throughout in different parts of the book as well. And I know that on occasion when you read or talk with people about this book, because you are a Palestinian American a woman, pardon me, who grew up as a girl outside of Chicago. I know that sometimes people think that this might be an autobiographical novel, and they ask you, is this your story? And I know that it's not your story. I know that it's a story that you wrote. It's not a story that you lived. But yet, as anyone who's read it and anyone who reads it will see, there's so much truth in it. It rings so true from beginning to end, that I'm curious that even though it's not a true story, how you found your way into the truth of the story, how you discovered it, how you found the authority to tell these things that aren't necessarily your exact life.
Yeah. And I do remember what you told me, Patty, about Dorothy Allison and fiction, being made up, but it's all true. And that whole idea, which I really love. And I think that speaks to most of my fiction. Obviously, some of the experiences of Athaf are going to be familiar. But, when I was doing what I call an exploratory draft now, I had multiple characters and it just wasn't working. And I realized that I wasn't getting close enough to these characters. So I sort of left it alone, and actually felt quite, defeated, because I felt like I was on a roll, but, it just didn't feel right. I had very vividly pictured the shooter and felt, he was pretty well drawn out, but the characters to tell the story were just not coming forward. And so when I finally had an epiphany, I realized that I needed to go back to the beginning before this heinous act is unfolding, the hate crime shooting. And if I didn't do that, then it would all be for naught, really, because this is a book about the stories that we carry, the choices we make, all the forces that bring us to these critical moments in time, which feels even more urgent now, as we are in the pandemic, as, we are, urging, this basic idea around, Black Lives Mattering and all of that. So when Athaf started to emerge, I realized, wow, this is definitely a character that I could spend more time sort of unearthing those stories, and to me that felt more important than the present tense shooting. So even that changed dramatically. So I was definitely calling back experiences growing up. I'm a child of the late 70s and 80s. And so those things, certainly are familiar, especially to people in my immediate communities. I've had so many wonderful messages from family and friends who, very tearfully saying how they were swept back, and I'm glad, because, that rendering, I suppose, was successful then and realistic. So yeah, there is certainly, myself in here, but not the autobiographical, it's definitely all these experiences and stories, I have carried as well.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I see in the sidebar here, Jessie Ann Foley, who was also a student at Columbia and also was a high school teacher, as you were, a teacher of young people, mentions too that there's something about that passage that speaks to her, the experiences that happen to us when we're teenagers stay with us forever. So again, even though those aren't your exact experiences, that awareness that I think young people have, I think, are really important to this story. And it's interesting to me because you also had mentioned that you didn't talk about teenage Athaf at first as the story was coming, and it was something that your agent or your editor helped you to discover. Can you talk a little bit about that process?
And I'm so glad, by the way, to see so many familiar faces in the chat. Jessie actually was the one who sort of pushed me to attend Columbia, Patty, because she was that full-time teacher. And I had come to the open house and she spoke so passionately. So I am grateful to her on so many levels. She's also visited my classroom, side note. So she's super. So that, I had a really, extraordinary experience in the querying and then in the editing process. And I'm so grateful. I learned so much. So when it made it to my editor, I had basically I leaped from 10-year-old Afaf to when she was getting close to the circle of women, so more of the college even, and even that changed, I would say, significantly. And my editor, Jill Bielowski of Norton, she's just wonderful. She said, I think we need to see Afaf struggling with, her sister's disappearance as a teenager. And it's exactly, what you said, what Jesse said. It's just such a, highly charged period in our lives. And I thought, duh, absolutely. And so it definitely affected plot in a way that I think really just served these characters really well and made that transition for Afaf to Islam, I think, even more believable, so I was grateful, and it was actually fun, I enjoyed going back to the 80s. I was a teenager part of the 80s and into the early 90s. So it was pretty great to go back and rewrite.
Well, and it helps too to have that part of her life, because that's when it's really obvious. Her damage is really obvious, and how it's affecting the choices that she makes.
Yeah.
And along those lines too, because you weren't afraid to tell these moments that aren't exactly, they wouldn't necessarily be comfortable for the characters, obviously, certainly not for the readers, maybe not even entirely for yourself as you were writing them. And you mentioned too that some of this is being told from the shooter's point of view. And we're not making any spoilers here. It's in the book description that there's a school shooter that Afaf has to come up face to face with. So I know that you addressed some of this book from his point of view. Would you mind reading a little of the shooter's story?
Sure. And so this is the first time we get close to him as readers. So his what I would call his first chapter, and I'm going to read just a little bit midway through that. So he has entered the school under the guise of being a maintenance man. Unfortunately, the security guard does not check his identification and just lets him through. This school was like any other he'd ever been inside. There were bulletin boards with college posters and announcements for scholarships. The floors gleamed under fluorescent ceiling panels. The old brown brick exterior of the building contrasted with the modern renovations he suspected had taken place over the decades. Except for the portraits of students showcased on the walls of the corridor, every single girl wearing a headscarf, grinning ear to ear, it was no different than other schools. He passed the gymnasium and he could hear girls running across the court, dribbling a basketball, cheering each other on. Next to a drinking fountain, he spotted a door with the sign, "Employees Only." He was about to enter when the gymnasium door suddenly pushed open. A panting girl came out. She wore track pants and a long-sleeve jersey with Nuruddin School printed across her flat chest, damp circles under her arms. He couldn't tell if her white scarf was wet, though her face glistened with sweat. He halted, frozen, his eyes darting from the young girl to the door she'd bolted through. That old familiar feeling of dispossession, of not belonging, coated his chest. Even this girl, thin black eyebrows raised as she took labored breaths from running, seemed to exude more confidence than he, a grown man, felt. She gave him a little wave before heading to a water fountain. He turned back to the door and quickly entered a closet full of cleaning supplies. He'd hated school when he was a kid, though he'd made decent marks. He dreaded getting called on to solve an equation at the board or to read a poem from Wordsworth out loud while his classmates followed along in their textbooks. The only tolerable teacher had been Mr. Hillix, a history teacher who'd been rumored to have been a spy for the Russians and in possession of Nazi silverware. Mr. Hillix's classroom contained world maps and framed antique cartography. He would trace his finger along the distance between countries like Peru and New Guinea and where he was. Maps made him seem closer to the places he couldn't pronounce. At first, that had given him hope of a place bigger than Wisconsin, especially after Joe left. He imagined his brother living in a foreign country after his service, and he hoped a postcard would appear someday from Joe featuring an exotic city or a dazzling beach. But a postcard or letter never came. Perhaps Joe had needed time to forget what he'd left behind in Vietnam. One day, government papers arrived proclaiming that Joe had been honorably discharged. His mother held the papers, looking them over and over, though she could not read English. She traced the official seal with her fingertips. He'd wanted to run away too, to escape his mother's misery and his own intense loneliness.
Well, thank you. What's remarkable about the way that you handle him in the book is that you give him space, but you don't let him take over. And I mean, in the plot, he takes over, right? But he doesn't take over the narrative, which I think is really masterful, the way that you've done that. And I don't imagine you got the balance exactly right the first time through. You want to talk a little bit about how you decided to tell what you told of his?
So, with risk of sounding morbid, I really enjoyed writing The Shooter, and I tell folks that I didn't do any research, in terms of domestic terrorists and hate crimes, more than what I knew, of course, because I really wanted to, just like Athaf, get really close to this character and begin to flesh him out and see him in this really realistic and authentic way. So what happened with an earlier draft is his chapters equaled Athaf's. So I had really drawn him out. And, there were some pretty, awful things and, few, celebrations in his life. But he sort of paralleled Athaf in the sense that they sort of lost siblings in these different ways. And they were both the children of immigrants, which I don't know. I was thinking about that point deliberately, consciously. But it's always wonderful when these things start to emerge. So having written those longer chapters, which only a few people have said, oh, I would have liked to sit with him some more, which is really interesting. When we got to the editorial process, again, another great conversation with my editor who said, as you said, Patty, this is really Athaf's story. So for me, I came to appreciate what my original plan was, this horrible threat in the school. So he became this really deliberate interruption for readers who get pulled away from Athaf to face this daily threat, while again, getting, close to, why does he decide to go in this school? So for me, again, it goes back to this idea of stories. That's what I've always been interested in. And it felt good to get readers that close, but he remains nameless. And then, to then move back into Athaf's story until, again, they meet face to face. So again, just a real deliberate disruption. And, I hope it's been seamless though, otherwise.
Well, there is something in the way that you make these pieces all fit together, because there are quite a number of pieces to the story. That first chapter, and if you haven't yet read the first chapter, I'll tell everyone to read it tonight. Buy the book. Try to find out if we can read it tonight. It is such a stunning first chapter. When I was talking to you about it the other day, I was actually sort of getting weepy on the phone, but it's both beautiful and so filled with love and so devastating what we know is happening at the end of it. And at that point, you pull back to 1975, I think, or 1976. And we find Athaf as a young girl jumping on a bed with her brother, which is such a sort of joyful release, even though as that chapter goes on, other things happen that aren't so joyful. And you move back and forth between this moment that's happening, this horrible, horrible moment that we don't really want to spend time with, but we need to know what's happening, the frame of the story. But then you also dip into these other sections, this beginning of her life and then earlier parts of her life, and then you move forward and then you give us a little of his. So you're grappling with all of these things. And I'm actually coming to something here. We're both big short story writers. We're fans of the short story. As a matter of fact, the first time we ever worked together was in a short story class. And so there is a sense of making something complete in these chapters, even though they're like tongue and groove, they rely on one another. And I know that you're first a short story writer, and I'm curious how you moved from that shutting the doors of the short story to still having that sense of telling us the full story, but then attaching that story to the next story and the next story.
So I was, pretty nervous when I sort of decided, okay, I'm going to write this novel, having the premise in mind, and, wondering what that transition was going to look like. Overall, it was pretty smooth, Patty, because these decades were episodes. So, I could sort of work them like short stories, raising the stakes and then coming to some sort of interesting resolution, but leaving that door open to connect, to the next chapter of her life, which would then be a decade later. But there, the 1976 in some ways feels like a self-contained. I look back at that and I think, maybe, it might be something that, if that was it, would still be satisfying. But of course, the point of the novel is to take, readers on this journey. But yeah, so working in this sort of episodic way was an easy transition for me. I'm struggling a little more on my current project because it's not set up in this way. So it's like having... for me, it was like having my first child, which was a cinch, and then struggling with my second daughter. And I'm like, and those, children not being the same. So it feels like a different kind of experience, but still learning, from the first one for sure. So I'm grateful for that. Yeah. And I was also grateful for an editor who helped make the transitions, smoother. She worked very closely with me, which I really appreciated.
You did an interview for Chicago Magazine, I think it was, where you talked, I think the title was something like Sahar Mustafah doesn't do happy endings, which makes me very happy as well. And I know that that there could be expectations for this book, and particularly for a book written by a Palestinian American, someone of a Muslim, that there might be some expectations about, fix us, save everything, solve it all for us, let this book carry us away. And I know that was never your intention. You talk a little bit about that in the interview. Would you mind talking a little bit about that with us? The idea of not having to, you're not trying to represent your entire people, but, or the way we should be to one another.
And I really love that Chicago Magazine interview. In fact, originally, and Patty, I think you were the one who linked, you sent it to me. I think you tagged me. So I didn't realize it was up yet. So again, so grateful for you and for your enthusiasm. And it was originally why Sahar Mustafah hates happy endings. And then I said something funny, and then they went back and said, okay, just because anybody who knows me, I tend to be bubbly and open. But I've sort of been resigned to, if I'm going to be writing about these particular characters in this community, but I think this obviously, it extends to, I think most writers. I'm thinking about your short story collection, Patty, Past, and then the one that I had the privilege of reading. The happy ending, I don't know that I've ever seen successfully done anyways, but I knew that would be a great burden in a book like this that was dealing with the hate crime. So I knew that the expectation was going to be, you need to make sure that, readers are left with at least the possibility of change. But I realize now that not just, change for the characters, because that, the book ends, right? You close the book, that's done. The characters are over, except in these wonderful ways that they still live with us. I'm thinking about how much we change as readers, when we engage in a book. I've been really very conscious of that, especially maybe more so this period of the pandemic, and the books that I've decided to pick up and what they've meant to me, from beginning to end. So I feel like there's victory at the end. So there are no spoilers here. But it wasn't this real dramatic, again, the happy ending of, and these people are going to be okay, because they're not, in real life, the constant burden of being a marginalized community, especially hijabi women. So yeah, I think ambiguous endings, and let's say hopeful endings is a little different from happy also. So I would say that in some ways it's a hopeful ending, and I'm sorry, I feel like I'm going on a tangent here. And again, readers will see how it's hopeful. Readers who reached out to me felt that, and in fact wanted her to go on. So they wanted more, of Atha and to stay with her a little bit longer, which is so great. So maybe that's hope, and but I've sort of decided that doesn't need to be my responsibility, per se. And we talked about this, Patty, especially being female writers, so female writers of color, but then also most women writers, are sort of tasked and charged with this. So I do hope that the audience will find it satisfying. It felt like the perfect ending, which I'm always really concerned about as much as beginnings too. And again, I've heard mostly, positive. So I guess that's good. Hopefully that answered your question.
Yep. Got to it all. And speaking of questions, I do want to remind people who are listening that you can enter through the Ask a Question tab at the bottom if you have a question that you'd like to ask us as well. Ask Sahar as well. And Sahar, you mentioned just briefly that you're working on a new project. Before we turn it over to some of these other questions that are coming up, would you mind talking a little bit about that project?
Sure. So I finished what is, a real rough draft, and I feel pretty grateful because I have wonderful writing groups, and it's great to be able to share and see how things are landing, in the initial stages. So it is set in Palestine. I have three major characters. One is an American-born Palestinian American who is probably more like a future Azmiya, Afaf's daughter. So I'm imagining also my own daughters who are third generation at this point. And, this particular character goes to Palestine with this idea that she is going to be able to do, to sort of save these women in this refugee camp. She works at a women's clinic, and of course, really doesn't have a clue. So, it's going to tackle privilege. The other two characters are natives, and I deal with a lot of the generational trauma and the trauma of memory. Which is really sort of marking Palestinians. That's something that I'm really interested when other Palestinian writers engage that. It's also something that we haven't been able to shed in terms of the occupation, obviously still as vibrant as ever. So I'm really enjoying these characters. I'm pretty close to them. But it's it's a tough story for sure, and we're going to see how their lives end up intersecting. And I really hope if readers love The Beauty of Your Face that they'll come back and check this novel out if it makes it to publication. So we'll see. So yeah, I've been enjoying it. And it was something I started a few years ago. Sometimes I get pulled by short stories, So I managed a short story this summer in between, and I've given myself that grace, to go with what is pulling me and what's taking my attention. Because I know some writers might tend to feel that guilt of, I just need to be on this project. And I just remember even my publicist saying, don't say that you're working on 3 projects. Just, tell folks that it's one so I don't look flighty or scattered. I'm like, what? It just shows that, I'm just like brimming, with all these, wonderful stories. And that's happened to me where I've been pulled in and out. So I actually do have 2 other ones that I hope will make it also, but I've sort of put away. I've disengaged for a little bit. Sometimes it's where I'm at, my headspace, sometimes it's emotional or something else might, be drawing my attention.
Well, I imagine there's a lot drawing your attention right now. For instance, your book just came out in the UK today, right? It was yesterday.
Was that Tuesday? I think it was, yeah. Well, this week. And you know what, Patty? The response there has been fantastic. So my daughter's convinced me to go on Instagram, which actually I really love. I've only been on Twitter, and then I went back on Facebook to connect with family and friends when the pandemic started. So Instagram has allowed me to, I have almost a direct line to readers. So it feels like almost daily I get a message, or I get some really wonderful photograph of my book with a cat or with, a cup of coffee. It's super. And there is definitely a large Muslim Arab community there too. And I have heard, from them, but this, crossing continents has just been so meaningful. I tell people, I hope that it will be translated in Arabic, just so, some of my family members who speak Arabic first, like my mother-in-law, I just think that would be extraordinary.
I agree.
Yeah.
I think absolutely it should be. It's also been published in Italy, right?
Yeah. And they've been fantastic too. So it's been a great journey so far.
So it's interesting, this launch, normally you would be in a big, huge crowd of people, and you are in a crowd of people, but you can't necessarily rub up against them or have them shake your hand or have you sign books. And I know there's a bunch of us who would love to hug you very tightly right now, but in this time, one of the really cool things about it, because of these virtual launches and virtual readings, and you are doing things all over the place, no wonder you're distracted. You have an international audience that you have immediate contact with in a way that you may not have had if this were more of a traditional time for publishing.
Yeah. So, I guess your question is, how has the pandemic?
More a comment, but you can answer it as a question too.
So I'd be lying if I said I wasn't sort of like devastated when, I realized that I wouldn't be launching this physically. And, the physical launch is really about friends and family, right? Because most people are still getting to know me or the book. It might have gotten, reviews and was on list and stuff. But to me, the launch has always been this wonderful celebration with family, friends, mentors. And I said, when we launched at Women and Children First for my short story collection, I'm like, I don't think this gathering, I think this gathering will happen again only at my funeral, because people, who I hadn't seen, in ages, had shown up and were so supportive. But what happened extraordinarily when the pandemic hit, book lovers, I'm just so indebted to book bloggers, book lovers who sort of rallied and then created these platforms to make sure that the pandemic books were going to get exposure. So I had just wonderful opportunities to be on virtual panels, and that hasn't stopped. So that continues. But what's amazing, Patty, is that I have done a lot of book clubs, and they've ranged from like libraries to teachers to I got a family, from the East Coast, and some of the members were scattered, who decided they were going to do a pandemic book club, and they chose my book first. And so they had reached out, and I don't know that, Zoom, I had heard of Zoom, but, we weren't really using Zoom. So everybody was Zooming, and so, people were great about reaching out and saying, would you mind, talking to us, in the evening and whatnot. And it's been amazing. So all that anxiety and dread is gone, and in many ways too, what, Patty, the virtual has made me feel less anxious too, as much as I feel like I'm a performer. I mean, I'm a teacher. There's even maybe this little bit of a buffer, but again, people show up for books because they love them. It's not like, it would have been contentious, but I feel like it felt also comfortable being at home with my husband and that close knit who I could be safely around. That I think I didn't realize how much I needed. So I am sad that I couldn't use my retractable markers for signing books, but they're there. So we'll get to that, I hope.
So I'm going to turn to some of the questions that have come up in the question bar here, and one that is almost sort of a spin-off of what you were just talking about, but goes in a slightly different direction. Nancy Johnson says, "Hi, Sahar. What's it like to release this novel at a time when America is finally reckoning with how it hasn't lived up to its ideals? And then does this book speak to the current moment, and how do you think it does?"
Yeah, thank you, Nancy. I think it does. So, when we think about the shooter, he is certainly representative of bigotry. And I think, in addition to that, what readers discover, if they haven't already read it, is that Afef really struggled with, her white community and assimilation, and basically assimilation failing for her, and in these really painful ways. And we also see her sister at the beginning of the book struggling with that. So, certainly when I think about marginalized communities, when I think about Islamophobia, this book, inevitably is addressing that. But again, I hope in a way that is meaningful and is very much just one story of bigotry, assimilation. So I would love for readers to, go on to read other writers, with similar backgrounds. That's my greatest wish. I feel like my book has just expanded the narrative, and maybe reading this book is going to make us feel a little bit differently about the work that we need to do, the work that has started with Black Lives and George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. It's been painful for me when I think about anti-Blackness within our Arab and Muslim communities and things that I've internalized. And there have been, just things that I sort of looked at twice, in even the way I was presenting Black characters, in my own work. So yeah, Nancy, I hope that answers your question. I think it's very timely, but I do hope that it endures in terms of it being like a new American story. Like I would love to see this like in an American lit, contemporary lit curriculum for sure. So any teachers out there, and I can Skype classes. I would love that.
I'm going to turn back to some process questions that have come up. Cher Blaine says, "I really enjoy how the novel moves back and forth in time, taking us, the readers, to different decades. How did you decide on that particular structure?" You talked a little bit about that, but maybe you could talk a little bit more about how you put the puzzle pieces together.
So let's see, it actually is a past tense, even at the beginning, even though that is our present tense. So we've got the, contemporary time frame, and that's the shooter. And even when we get into the shooter, we do get some flashback into his life. But I did this thing where when we're in Afaf's life, I make that present tense, which I felt like that would make it an immediate engagement, for readers to be right there, because I had decided then I needed to start with her origin story, so to speak. So I was very deliberate about keeping that present tense, but then that will, it comes back to the present tense when Afaf and the shooter come face to face, when she's an adult later. And yeah, the present tense, even now when I'm writing stories and novels, can also be jarring. So I realized, boy, there were some things that were quite painful in the way I was presenting them, but it was good. So that sort of discomfort felt good and felt authentic.
I love this idea of feeling discomfort while you're writing, and not being afraid to let your characters feel discomfort or let your readers feel discomfort. I think sometimes people get a little afraid of that, and you're definitely not a writer who's got any sort of fear. So.
Yeah, discomfort, it means that something's shifting, right, inside of us, in terms of our values maybe being challenged, our ideals. So yeah, discomfort is definitely also, I think, a good place from which change, might start too.
So we have another question, and this one's from Elizabeth. When it might be a good place to carry this through. When you were writing your first draft of this book, what motivated you or helped you move forward in the times you felt stuck? Do you have any advice for other aspiring novelists?
So I don't know that I felt stuck, which told me that this was going well. So I was definitely feeling stuck in the earlier drafts, and maybe that's what Elizabeth is referring to. So let me start with that experience. So that kind of stuckness, I then put it down. So I put the draft away, and it took a whole summer for me to just sort of contemplate it. I was definitely working on other things. So I would urge, Elizabeth, if she is also an aspiring novelist, and others, again, to be patient and to give yourselves a break. If something's not working, you might have to just temporarily let it sit and then come back to it. For me, sometimes it's a week, sometimes it's weeks, and in this case, it was months. And then when I was ready to go back to school, I realized what I needed to do. But, in terms of writer's block, and I'm not sure if that was what Elizabeth was getting at, I actually love the things that we did at Columbia College, Patty, all those things where switching point of view, maybe introducing like the supernatural, maybe changing tense, I think I even experimented with Ataf being the first person. So yeah, and earlier things. So I would say definitely for initial drafts, remember the first shitty draft, right? Idea, and basically don't be too hard on yourselves, and come back to it with this idea that it's also going to keep evolving. Mine evolved with my agents, and then it kept evolving when we got to the editorial stages, for sure.
Was that different from
when
when
you
you
were afraid of that? Yeah.
Was that the idea of it evolving? Was that more of an evolution working with the large house than with your first book? Was your first book much of an evolution? Or
Yeah, with the first collection, Patty, it was definitely not as intense, so that was more or less, which stories were going to stay, and, some of the just sort of copy editing, but with the large publishing house, not only did I have to, rewrite and add and revise, then I had to go through very, very stringent copy editing. And that was somebody else. So that was like a whole other department, and a lot of like fact checking, so to speak. So I think, even the cultural stuff, they wanted to make sure I was consistent, with all of the cross language and cross cultural, aspects, which I learned a lot from that. I had to spell things phonetically, for example, and I realized I need to be more consistent with that, just so it doesn't become so laborious later on.
Right. Okay. Well, I think we're running out of time. People seem to be enjoying the conversation. It'd be great if we could continue to talk. I think that Sarah is going to jump in again and say something to us. But I want to thank everybody for being here. Sahar, I definitely want to thank you for letting me be part of this celebration of your beautiful, beautiful, beautiful book. I'll pick it up and show it again one more time.
Patty, this has meant so much to me. So, you were first my mentor, and now, you are my dear, dear friend. I still consider a mentor. And this has just been so great. Thank you. And thank you to the audience who tuned in.
Thank you both so much. That was such a wonderful conversation, and you covered so much territory in such a short amount of time. And thank you, audience, for your questions and your love in the chat bar. It was wonderful to have all of you join us in this virtual space. And if you haven't purchased the book, please do so using the Buy the Book box at the bottom. We ship anywhere in the United States. And we also are open for you to come into the store safely. So thank you both so much for a wonderful evening. And thank you, Sahar, for this incredible novel.
Oh, thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Sarah. Much love. Women and children first.
All right. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Nice to see you all.